This past week, I was talking to a group of people about our new upcoming discussion series that I mentioned earlier, the podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, which starts, I'll tell you again, this Wednesday, September 1st via Zoom. Let me know if you need the link. Happy to give it to you. Anyhow, I could tell that some of the people in the group had no idea what I was talking about. Not only did they not know that Mars Hill was the name of an extremely popular congregation, church here in the Seattle area for nearly 20 years, they didn't know where the name Mars Hill came from. So I told them just really briefly what it was about, and when they replied, "Well, that's super interesting," I realized that this story may be one of those stories that pastors just assume that everyone knows, so they don't explain it. So today, I'm going to explain this weird name, Mars Hill, to you. So it's kind of going to be like a combination sermon slash Now, the congregations that name their churches Mars Hill are referring to a passage in Acts 17, where the Apostle Paul is in Athens at the Areopagus, which means Hill of Ares, or Mars Hill. The Greeks called this god Ares, and the Romans called him Mars. Now, Mars was the god of war, you may remember. This area in Athens is an elevated open-air site just west of the Acropolis in Athens. In classic times, it functioned as kind of a high court of appeals for criminal and civil cases because, as the legend goes, Ares was tried here by the gods for the murder of Poseidon's son. Okay, so in Paul's time, it was an area where public debate was heard. Okay, so for you to understand why churches have taken the name Mars Hill, let me explain to you Acts 17. Okay, Paul was traveling in Athens, and as he walked throughout the city, he would have seen statue after statue, temple after temple, monument after monument, all dedicated to the Greek gods. Paul would have seen, for example, the Temple of Demeter with statues of the goddess and her daughter. He would have maybe seen a statue of Poseidon hurling his trident through the air. Beyond this, he would have seen the statues of Athena, Zeus, Apollo, and Hermes, and the sanctuaries of Dionysus. That's what he saw as he walked around. There was an ancient proverb declared, in fact, that there were more gods in Athens than men. And wherever Paul looked, in niches and on pedestals, in temples and on street corners, were gods and demigods. Busts of Hermes were on every corner, and statues and altars were in courtyards of every home. Okay, so back in Paul's day, people would go to these different temples and statues to pray and give offerings. For example, if you wanted protection for your marriage, you would go and pray at the shrine of the god Hera. Or, for example, if you wanted safe travels at sea, you'd make a sacrifice to Poseidon. You'd go here to ask for a good harvest, you'd pray for healthy children and at yet another temple, and make offering for success at another place, and just all sorts of different gods and occasions. Okay, so Paul sees how this culture works, and then he points out how religious these Athenians are. And this is what he says: Athenians, I see how extremely religious you all are in every way. For as I went through your city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, "To an unknown God." Now, archaeologists have yet to find an altar to an unknown God in Athens, but such an altar would not be a surprise, and it would not be unique. Outside of Rome, there has been found an altar dedicated to the unknown gods. So why build an altar to an unknown God? Well, a 3rd century author tells a legend of a plague that took place in Athens nearly 1,000 years earlier. He says that a magician ended the plague by bringing a herd of sheep to the Acropolis and releasing them. Now, apparently each sheep was followed, and when it laid down, it was sacrificed to the god whose temple was nearest to that area of the city. Now, according to this legend, a sheep laid down in an area where no temple seemed close. So, that sheep was sacrificed to an unknown god. Makes sense? We don't have any historical records of that event, but it makes a good story, doesn't it? Good legend. It also makes sense. It seems that the Greeks would want to cover all of their bases and make sure they weren't angering any gods. They just happened to forget. They wanted to play it safe. Okay, so back to Acts 17, where Paul's next move is brilliant. He claims to speak for this unknown God whom they already worship. He uses this altar, the altar to the unknown God, to his advantage in introducing the Athenians to Jesus. This is what Paul says: "Let me tell you about this unknown God, because I know who it is. I'm here to introduce you to this God, so you can worship intelligently, knowing who you're dealing with. This is the one who made the world and everything in it. This master of sea and sky. This God doesn't live in custom-made shrines or need the human race to run errands for him, as if he couldn't take care of himself." Then Paul goes on to preach to the Athenians and tell them all about how God raised Jesus from the dead. When the Apostle Paul stood atop Mars Hill, he proclaimed good news to a diverse people, steeped in diverse philosophy, culture, and spirituality. That's why some churches and schools and institutions use the name Mars Hill today. Paul used the rhetoric of the day, the method of his day, to tell those people about Jesus. The Mars Hill churches of today are saying that they strive to use the rhetoric of our day and the culture and methods of our day to tell folks about Jesus. Make sense? There you have it. Our culture, and specifically Seattle's culture, is much like 1st century Athens. A marketplace of ideas, a vibrant art community, a metropolitan hub, but one that doesn't know Christ. We have all heard the statistics of how Seattle is one of the most unchurched cities in the country. Think of how our culture is like that 1st century Athens culture. Now, we may not have shrines to Greek gods, but we have our own shrines of types. We can go to stadiums and worship the god of sports. We can go to the opera, the symphony, the theater, or the museum to worship the gods of culture. We can go to the multiplex or the bookstore or even our own couch to make offering to the gods of entertainment. We can go to the mall or the internet and use our credit cards to make sacrifices to the gods of consumerism. None of these things are bad, but like the Greeks, we have so many options. There are so many things that pull us this way and that. There are so many things that vie for our time, our attention, for our hearts and our minds. Yet, in the midst of all of that, there is one true God. Christ is in the midst of our culture. As Paul preaches to them, he introduces a new way of understanding God. He says that all humanity has been searching for God, groping for God, but God is not far from each one of us. For in God we live and move and have our being. I'm sure you've heard that phrase before. In God we live and move and have our being. It's Paul using the words of a famous Greek poet to explain this unknown God. God is not a God who can be contained in a shrine or a temple, but God is also not a God who is in us or even in our hearts. Instead, Paul is saying that we are in God. Our concepts of God have been too narrow. We are in God. Paul uses womb imagery to say, in God, we live and move and have our being. God's grace, love, mercy, forgiveness is bigger than we humans could ever understand. By the grace of God, we have been called and made God's offspring. We are encompassed by this God and by God's compassion. May you live and move and have your being in the knowledge and joy that you are in God. Amen.